happier if I had the mic? Oops, did you turn on? Would you be happier if I had the mic on? The mic is, that's okay.
Yeah, it's better.
With or without?
With.
With. All right, we'll do it with. All right. The title of this evening's talk, Future of Work, is not a title on which I usually speak. In fact, this is the first time I've ever done a talk entitled The Future of Work. The user group asked me to do that. And as is so often the case, doing a talk with a title that I did not choose induced me to go out and do some research that I would otherwise not have done and think about some things that I would otherwise not have thought, so I appreciate that. People ask me sometimes what the process is for getting all these presentations that I do approved, at which point I look and say, what? Because we don't have a team that's willing to work 24/7 and be with me between midnight and 6 a.m. To do approvals, because in fact a lot of this stuff, at least a third of the slides you're going to see, did not exist at this time 24 hours ago. I have groups that occasionally say, could you give us your slides in advance? And I say, how far in advance? Well, we'd like them 2 weeks in advance. Really, you want stale material, do you? Sometimes they'll say, could we get them the day before? And I'll say, really, you want stale material, do you? Because in any good talk, there's at least one slide that simply could not have been done more than a few hours beforehand, because that's how au courant you folks are. So I want to do some stuff tonight that we haven't done before and see what we all wind up thinking about it. A few years ago, NASA pointed the Hubble Space Telescope at what appeared to be a completely empty patch of sky and let it sit there for a while, pointing at exactly one empty piece of sky for a really long time. This is difficult to do. My wife is a rocket scientist whose specialty is making spacecraft point at something that they're supposed to point at and keep doing it. She just retired after 36 years. She was tough. But when you realize that that completely empty patch of sky, when you gave it enough time to yield up its photons, produced this, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, you can kind of throw up your hands and say, no matter where I look, there's more than I can count. There's more than I can understand. There's more than I can keep up with. And I hear this from people a lot. They ask me questions like, how do you keep up with it? How do you give people a list of 13 different topics you can do for keynotes? And a lot of what I want to share tonight is about strategies for dealing with what many people just today seem to find very difficult. Pat Gelsinger at VMware recently said, however rapid the pace of change seems today, understand something. This is the slowest it's going to be for the rest of your life. Right now, we're just in the warm-up phase. The really good stuff will start tomorrow. I'm sorry, the really good stuff will start the day after tomorrow. We could go on like this for a while. So when people ask me, how do you keep track of it all? The answer is that I don't. I don't try to keep track of it all, because a few years ago, people figured out that you don't have to count all the stars to understand certain fundamental things about stars. The universe boils down to 4 simple ideas, 4 forces. And if you look at it and everything you see is, oh, okay, I know which bucket that's in. That's a gravity thing, that's an electromagnetic thing, that's a nuclear thing. Everything makes sense once you've got a pretty good set of buckets, and everything you see, gets distributed into the right ones, and it either reinforces things or it contrasts with things or whatever. But it gives you a way of coping with what would otherwise be overwhelming complexity, overwhelming growth, overwhelming rates of change. And so the question then is, well, okay, we are not, most of us, nuclear physicists, except when some of us in our spare time. But the question then is, well, what are the 4 fundamental forces of the world in which we do our work? Every now and then I do a little thought experiment. I pull up the technology page of the Reuters app on my phone, or the technology theme of the New York Times app on my phone, and just confirm that on any given day, everything I'll see pretty much flows into one of 4 buckets. The first one is the connection bucket. The amount of connection in the world during the period 2007 to 2020 will have grown by over a factor of 1,000. Total amount of bandwidth available. That's not an incremental change. That fundamentally changes the kinds of thing that you will collect, that you will share, the kinds of actions that you will consider taking. So it's important to understand connection is a thing. It is one of the four fundamental forces of what we are now seeing. And it affects international relations, it affects things like IoT, it changes our definition of what is money, it changes a lot of things. The next one is collaboration. To some degree, a side effect of connection. Of course, if I introduce connection into a toxic culture, I don't get collaboration. I get everybody building bigger and better reinforced silos. I get people better, more vigorously defending what is now a more valuable bottom drawer database. So connection enables collaboration. It certainly does not guarantee it. Connection is an engineering accomplishment. Collaboration is a cultural thing. It requires management, it requires leadership, it requires basic goodwill and mutual respect among people to make that happen. All of these things, however, are happening at an accelerating rate. The hockey stick curves are real. People keep expecting them to turn into S-curves. They say, well, this technology is going to level off at a certain point. Yes, it does, but when that hockey stick turns into an S-curve, a different technology comes along, and it comes in with another curve, and then another curve, and the aggregate effect is hockey stick curves. And people say, oh, that's just a Silicon Valley hype expression. I'm sorry, I can point to the computer on your desktop and show you the hockey stick growth of everything that it does, and it's not really slowing down. The reason it doesn't look like it's slowing down is that so much now of the band of the speed isn't going into refreshing the screen more quickly. We used to be able to review products with a stopwatch. The old joke about a product called Context MBA, which was written in UCSDP system, is that it was very difficult to benchmark because sundials don't work at night. It was a little slow. And then we started getting to the point where, when was the last time you bothered to clock the recalc speed of any spreadsheet? You just don't. They're all effectively instantaneous. The hard part now is what? Collecting the data, coming up with the data model, figuring out how to debug the logic. Spreadsheets are very, very, very good at sharing bad formula logic across the organization. This is the only collaborative task that they perform well. But many organizations are essentially run by spreadsheets, and the IT department is the archival department of the decisions made by spreadsheets. Why? Because the IT department's not doing the cultural engineering they need to do to be seen as an agile partner in good enough problem solving. Instead, they're still capital intensive, skills intensive, process intensive pyramid builders. And building pyramids was a good gig for a while. It's not currently a thing. So acceleration. If you don't have a plan for dealing with acceleration, then you really don't have a plan. If your plan is great, except that it only gets about a week's worth of planning done every 3 months, it doesn't work. When I joined Salesforce, which was coming up about 11 years ago in January, one of the things that was mentioned that obviously stuck in my mind on employee new hire orientation day is you're joining a company with a 12-quarter year. Because what that means is every month we look at numbers, we do analysis versus goals, we make behavior changes, we make assignment changes on a monthly cadence that many organizations don't even attempt to do more often than quarterly. And that is among the reasons why we've been able to grow at the pace we have without choking on our own waste products, which is really, at this point, the hardest thing we're doing, is doing the sustained growth year on year, doubling the company every 3 years. Companies come to talk to us. Whether or not we've got the world's best CRM is really no longer the most important factor in making people want to make the trip to San Francisco to spend a day with us. They really want to spend a lot of time just finding out, how are you doing this? They want to talk to us about our growth management, about our talent management, about our cultural stuff. Because at this point, we're sort of the existence proof that something interesting is going on. And you guys, of course, the Salesforce community is among the exemplars of this extraordinary cultural phenomenon that's being achieved. Is it enabled by something like Trailhead? Sure. Does Trailhead force it to happen? No, clearly not. Clearly not. It encountered fertile ground, we might say. And then there's this one. I first called it AIification. We all agreed that was a terrible name. And someone said, after the movie came out, someone said, how about ex machination? That's really got a lot of good value to it as a label, because it, the expression deus ex machina, the plot device of the incompetent writer who just makes something, and then a miracle occurs in the last 5 minutes of the last act and everything gets solved. So, God out of the machine or God out of the mechanism. But also the highest priority concern in the minds of many of our customers is no longer the fear I would sometimes encounter 10 years ago. Oh my gosh, if we put our stuff in the cloud, we lose all control, that's scary. That stopped being the thing 5 or 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, the new fright that was expressed to me was, oh my gosh, you're going to put our IT department out of a job. That was the new fear, that we were going to be too good, and that we were going to make developer productivity high. Of course, as it turned out, all those things that people were limping along doing with a spreadsheet and email, when they discovered they could have a secure, mobile, collaborative app that got better 3 times a year and that they never had to do the data backup to keep running, all of a sudden a lot of things turned out to be apps in waiting, latent apps, as it were. We pointed the telescope at an empty patch of sky, and oh my gosh, look at all those apps that people wanted, that they never dared to suggest you bring in a systems integrator to do, because everyone knew the problem was changing too quickly, it would become a money pit, whatever. And the biggest accomplishment of Force.com and the rest of the platform over the last few years has been to get people to say, why are you doing that with a spreadsheet? You don't need to tolerate all the things that are wrong with that. But oddly enough, we do these half-day events, platform essentials events, where we interview customers. I've been known to do the occasional interview. And people almost never acquired us to be a platform. They discovered that they had a platform under the floor of the thing they were using to do other stuff. Many people essentially use this as a contact manager. They still haven't even discovered the CRM capability, really. But then someone, having tried it every other way, says, can you think you can do this with Salesforce? And someone like you says, before lunch? That'd be good. And you've got a working prototype before lunch, and people say, what? When did you start working on this? 10 minutes after we talked. And that's when they discover what the platform really is. And so that was the concern 5 years ago, is that the IT department, qua IT department, would lose its job. So what's the next 10 years? I had this conversation with a group of students in Missoula, Montana, where one of our partner companies has people in the classroom doing business case study problem resolution, as part of which the students all sign up for a free developer account on Salesforce. Why? Well, why not? What do you have them do? Write in Visual Basic? And they're able to implement amazing solutions in a one-semester class. Doing quite extraordinary stuff, amazing stuff, and this is typically their first exposure to Salesforce. But I was having a debrief with them after they did their final project presentations last week, where I said, you need to understand the 3 acts of Salesforce. The first 10 years, we sold high risk, high reward opportunity to people who were paid to take risks. Sales tools for salespeople. They weren't afraid. They weren't afraid of subscribing to a CRM online because they knew they were going to get something better than they'd be able to squeeze out of their traditional tech procurement process. And the ones who made it big go to club. Salespeople are encouraged to take risk and richly rewarded when it pays off. And for the first 10 years, that was exactly the profile of who we needed to have as a customer. And then was the second 10 years. IT people have never in their life been congratulated for taking a risk. They get to keep their jobs if they don't take a bad risk, or if they contain necessary risks. So the first 10 years, sell risk-taking tools to risk takers. The next 10 years, we essentially had to learn a whole new vocabulary of selling risk-reducing tools to risk containers. So what's the third decade? What I told the kids in Missoula is, our new challenge is selling scary stuff to scared people. Because that's what we've got. We're saying, we're going to democratize AI. Some people here, you're going to put me out of a job. We're going to democratize access to the platform. Some people here, you're going to take these skills that I've spent 20 years polishing and make them irrelevant. This is the challenge that all of us as a community must acknowledge exists. You folks, to a considerable extent, feel like you've got this. You're already drinking from the goblet. You've got this. You understand. A lot of people do not understand. They're still fuzzy on what's this cloud thing. Dilbert's still able to get a lot of jokes out of people's fundamental failure to understand what the internet does and doesn't do. Commerce, of course, is completely impossible. Well, it's like this collection of tubes. You all heard that one, right? So, dealing with this last one, ex machination, the technology is fascinating, but I've been involved one way or another with the technology of AI for 32 years. Let me tell you, I was present for the autopsy of the first two generations of AI. I can tell you why it failed. And fortunately, that means I can tell you why Einstein's going to succeed before we're done tonight. I'll probably have shared that. So let's move on. Oh yeah, the title slide. For those of you who watch Madam Secretary, you know they usually get to the opening credits about 12 minutes in. Monty Python did an episode once where the opening credits ran at minute 28, were followed by a 1-minute summary of what had just happened, followed by the closing credits. I'm not going to be that extreme tonight. Here I am. We're already at the title slide, so let's move on. Number one, I said the forcing function is connection. Everyone knows we're more connected. Most people really have not come to grips with the quantities. This is, global data center IP traffic from 2012 to 2020. Notice two things. One, a hockey stick curve. And two, the black slices at the top representing the stuff happening in a traditional data center are actually now smaller. I don't mean in relative terms, they're actually smaller. Less traffic goes through traditional data centers today than did in 2012. And the majority is all the other stuff. Look at Intel. They used to think that their big money was going to be made selling processors for PCs. The most important pivot Intel's doing right now is really optimizing the business around the needs of the places where growth happens, which have, I would say, names on the door, except that we all anonymize our data centers. So if you could find out whose building that is, it would be Amazon's or Google's or ours. So the data traffic, 46% cloud to 92% cloud between 2012 and 2020. Put another way, we went from roughly 1/2 to roughly 1/12 of the traffic being in traditional data centers. So if you don't have a plan for retiring your last traditional data center, at this point you're a few years behind the curve. That was not a statement I made a few years ago. The first time I had a water utility in UK tell me that they had a timetable for the retirement of their last owned data center, I was actually taken aback. I wasn't anticipating that. I didn't think a water company would be the first company ever to tell me that they expected to be out of the data center business. Now interestingly, at Dreamforce in 2007, someone asked me at a CIO panel, if this cloud thing is such a great idea, why is Salesforce building its own data centers? How come you're not running on Amazon? Now at the time, the only answer I could give them was, FedEx doesn't call UPS to make its deliveries. At some point, you need to say, well, no, there are core competencies here. And at that time, being able to do what we did with pods, this is why we were able to run the planet on 10,000 servers compared to roughly 10,000 to run that workload and anything else. In fact, because we can put our server centers, our service hubs, I prefer to call them, in places where there's gas or hydro or other renewable electrical power, we cut the CO2 footprint of a given business task workload by 95%. Yes, a factor of 20 reduction to get the same business stuff done. Because you think about the perversity of what's going on in a lot of places that call themselves cloud hubs. You've got an operating system like Linux, a multitasking operating system, running a thing called a hypervisor, a thing that runs lots of tasks, but it's the only task that's running on the Linux. The Linux is a multitasking system that's running one task, that's the hypervisor. The hypervisor is designed to run lots of separate things, and it's running a separate copy of Windows in every one of those. Each copy of Windows is laden with code designed to make multiple things run simultaneously, but each copy of Windows is only actually running one app. It's not really hard to do a factor of 20 reduction in CO2 workload when we are not doing a multitasker that runs a multitasker that runs a multitasker that runs a single task. There's a lot of CPU cycles we're not burning. And yet, almost none of our customers realize this, and essentially none of our non-customers have any clue that such a thing is even possible. This is one of the messages that we have failed to deliver. Because when the entire world is using 3 to 6% of its electrical power to run servers, well, gee, if we could do a 95% reduction of the CO2 footprint of 6% of the electrical power on the planet, that would be worth a few years of global warming hold off.
And yet, we don't really communicate it very well. It's not the conversation people invite us to have. The other thing about that connectivity is that now mobile is clearly not an accessory. Guess what? Mobile is now the majority of the use. The majority of internet usage worldwide between 09 and 16, mobile is now the dominant thing. And maybe you saw the stats we put out after Black Friday, where for the first time ever, mobile devices did more buying on Black Friday than PCs did. I'm sorry, Cyber Monday. This is how people get stuff done. My wife and I did a highly unscientific sample of 3 stores on Black Friday. One of them was able to sell us what we came to buy. One of them kept us waiting in a line for 30 minutes because they couldn't do credit card processing. We wound up leaving the merchandise on the stand and walking out. And in the third one, we wound up sitting in the cafe, so they made the profit on a $5 mocha while we pulled out my phone and got on Amazon Prime and ordered all the stuff that they no longer appeared to sell there. Well done, guys. And thanks for the cafe experience. It was great. And this is the other interesting thing that's happened. The world now, on average, has more than one cell phone number per living human being. We crossed that threshold pretty recently, too. Yes, there are places like Singapore where it's way over 1. Central and Eastern Europe have 1.4 cell numbers per person. Probably everyone wants at least one that the government doesn't know about. There are parts of the world where it's only 81%. Africa's catching up, though. Because why? Well, for one thing, you don't run copper wire across vast swaths of terrain when you know that within a week it will have been dug up and sold as scrap metal. You don't put copper in the ground in some parts of the world. They're leapfrogging straight to high bandwidth mobile. And so you're seeing this point where, for the first time in human history, we can pretty much assume that anyone who wants to know who you are or find out what you know could do it. This isn't all about gross quantity of bandwidth either. There are people who say, oh, we don't have broadband in Africa. I say, you know what? If you're a rural farmer and all you really need to know at 6 a.m. is should I go east or west to sell my crop at the best price today? It's 1 bit, left or right. What do I do today? I don't need a cat video to make a material difference in my family's well-being with a tiny, tiny amount of bandwidth that's always available to me exactly when and exactly where I need it to be. And that's not the rich world conversation about bandwidth. Everyone in the rich world talks about in terms of how many Netflix movies can we stream. There's a huge planet out there that's just on the verge of discovering stuff that we thought everybody knew. I ran across this stat quite recently when I was working on a customer summit session for a major payments processor. There are 2 billion people on the face of the planet today who don't have the equivalent of a checking account. They have no mechanism by which they can make a payment other than by handing over physical currency or maybe a chicken or two. And if you're in the payments industry, well, you could say we've got a strategy. We're going to take share away from VM and Amex. Or you could say, well, wait a minute. If the strategy is to grow our audience, the traditional way to do that is by fighting zero-sum games against the other people who do what we do. But now we've got access to a universe full of dark matter, a whole lot of things that look like empty spaces before, and it turns out they're full of stars. There's 2 billion people out there waiting to be brought into the fold of people with modern financial access. And it's just one of many markets in which I can point to. Vast, undiscovered territory that sits there because no one has it on their goals list to increase penetration by 10% in a market where they currently have 0. Because 10% growth where you've got 0 would still be 0, right? So it doesn't fit into your spreadsheet. That's why you need to sit back and say, wait a minute, what are the fundamental forces here? What are the things that are masked by our habits from becoming our strategies? On-body tech is getting pretty good. The Apple Watch obviously has gotten way faster, way better, but the fact is, even if you put a Hermes face and a leather band on it, that's still the manual for it. You still have to know about things like doing updates. You still have to know about things like shutting down an app and restarting it. There's still a lot of friction and rust in the system. The awareness that it's technology is still a little bit hard to shed. I still know people who are dismissing notifications one at a time because no one taught them if you do a force touch, it pops up, oh, you want to clear all? It's not discoverable. It's too much technology, as opposed to this thing, which some of you may have seen this slide before. My great white shark cage diving, mountain biking, kayaking, skydiving son who just got back from his Peace Corps gig in Guyana wears one of these. Solar powered, radio synchronized. It handled 200 meters of water, 15 G's of acceleration. If it's ever broken, he's probably lost his arm by then. He's been wearing that puppy for, at this point, maybe, I don't know, 8, 9 years. It's a little scuffed up. And he never thinks about recharging it, or updating it, or anything. It just works. And that's the direction where we need to go. The world doesn't need a better version of something you have to think about. It needs things to become more and more invisible and frictionless. And in fact, a fellow named Gem took Arthur Clarke's famous law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so it's a very simple logical inversion to say any technology that is distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. The reason I took this job going on 11 years ago is that sitting across the table at a breakfast meeting with Mark, which I wrote a column about the following week, I said, I've seen technology that's distinguishable from magic. In that column, I contrast a $2,500 software package from, may it rest in peace, Sun Microsystems, Java Enterprise Studio, that was very proudly marketed with, and now you can set up your security server with one click, and you can set up your app server with one click. And my comment to Mark, which I put in the column, is that's 2 clicks too many. I don't want to set up a security server. I don't want to think about load balancing. I want it to just happen. And what Mark and I talked about going on 11 years ago, actually more than 11 years ago that we had the conversation, 13 years ago we had the conversation, was write the app with no more difficulty, in fact probably less than you would need to write an app that runs on a single PC, and we'll take care of the rest. That was the Force.com ethos. You worry about the app, we'll worry about the rest. There's nothing else out there that's really even aimed at that target very well, let alone been hitting it for this long. And it's a very simple statement. Mark was really good at simple statements. Apex Code came from a one-sentence charge to the team saying, we need a full custom code capability, but it can't compromise any of the benefits of multi-tenancy. Go do it. If it were easy, the fact that it's existed for going on 10 years now might have induced at least one other company somewhere to have done one. Does anyone know of anything that does what Apex Code does other than Apex Code, where it feels like code and it runs with acceptable performance, and our customizations don't require you to re-implement your customizations? Our upgrades don't require you to re-implement all your customizations? I'm not aware of anything else that exists that does this. I don't know why. Once we've demonstrated that it's possible, they should have been able to get it done. They must just not realize it's important. Well, the result of technology that is indistinguishable from magic is that a lot of stuff's going to get really good. When Tim Cook brought the Apple Watch out on stage, it was only after 15 minutes of talking about new opportunities for medical research, talking about testing for things like Parkinson's disease and stuff, because the technology is on your body all the time. It was a radical idea. It's now what Apple and Fitbit are sort of dueling back and forth over. Which one can warn you that your heart's doing weird stuff? And not just count your heart rate, but actually warn you of things like arrhythmias? Really? And so you've got Apple and Aetna talking about making the Apple Watch part of this stuff. We're talking about taking wearables and understanding all sorts of disorders simply by the ability to say, we're not going to test you under the peculiar circumstance that you're sitting in a doctor's office in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar anxieties. We're going to monitor your behavior during normal activity. Ford is talking about putting biometric stuff in cars because when you're commuting every day, it's a chance to just kind of check certain signature behaviors. Your car as biometric device. Why not? Because they're not looking at it as a bigger, faster car. They're looking at it as a space in which you live with certain predictable behavior patterns and asking interesting questions like, well, with the right kind of connectivity and the right kind of processing power, what could that opportunity create? And it is not about building a better Mustang. It's about building a better space that happens to have wheels and moves around. When you introduce on-body technology and include location awareness, a lot of things that are currently kind of clunky to do become much more straightforward. You want to change your seat on a flight. You have to go to the airline website, log in, forgot my password, record locator for flight, oh heck, where's that? Eventually get to the point where you can ask for a different seat. Or you can do it the way KLM does it. You're in Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, you pull out the phone, you go to KLM and say, hey, can you change my seat? It knows who you are, or at least it assumes you're the person who's supposed to be using that phone. It probably knows where you are, unless you've made it really difficult for them by turning off location services, and I don't know why you would do that. And it's got all this context, and it can make a reasonable assumption. Oh, you mean the flight that's leaving in the next 2 hours? That flight? Oh, sure, you can change your seat. Much more immediate resolution. This is not the kind of AI we talked about in the late 80s and early 90s that was for experts to use to formulate rules and do elaborate inferencing and other stuff. No, this is about making the tool disappear into its function, which is a phrase I stole from an essay by Martin Heidegger called The Origin of the Work of Art. And when you do it right, the tool disappears into its function. If you think about this, when you're hammering a nail, you are not conscious of there being a hammer in your hand unless something is wrong with the hammer. If it's too big, if it's too small, if the handle is cracked, if the head is coming loose, you become aware of the tool. And this is an indicator that you are using either a defective or an inappropriate tool. So you're using the right tool, you stop thinking about it, and all your focus is going into your task. And this is what we're trying to do now. We're not trying to build a better, sexier, cooler version of something that's even recognizable as an application. We're saying the job of the application is to be invisible, to disappear. And of course, as some of you know, we have built a world-class team to do this. These guys are not just sprinkling some AI cinnamon on the latte of CRM and saying, what good boys are we? They're doing work that is outperforming in various standard benchmarks, Microsoft, Google, now Alphabet, and IBM. Some of you may have seen the Einstein keynote at Dreamforce. We can show it a picture and say, how many men are standing on top of the truck? And it figures out what's the truck, which are the men, which ones are on top. It doesn't need to be led by the hand through this. It figures it out. It can count Coca-Cola bottles. It does stuff. It does stuff that would otherwise occupy a human being to do relatively low-value tasks that previously needed a person. And that's one of the things we need to communicate to the scared people. It doesn't want your job. It wants some tasks that currently keep you from having time to do your job. It wants to take some tasks off your plate that currently take way more of your time than they should, aren't much fun, are difficult to do perfectly, create enormous problems when done imperfectly. Why do you want to do that exactly? When there's a cheap algorithm on a cheaper processor that's prepared to do that for you, so you can do the good stuff. And educating people and the cultures of which they're part to do that is the future of their work and is the present of our work. This is what we do now. This is what Salesforce and its community do now. This thing AI, I googled the label AI when I was going to go talk to the dairy farmers. It turns out AI is an acronym they've been using for a long time. It stands for artificial insemination. So there's a certain difficulty of doing relevant application searches in certain industries because they already thought they owned that acronym. The introduction of the other kind of AI that does not involve syringes into the dairy industry is, however, proceeding. For example, noticing that when cows walk in a certain way, it's an early warning of developing a hoof disease, which can have material impacts on their productivity. And now we can detect that. Could you previously pay someone who could notice that the cow is walking funny to sit at the gate every day when they come in for milking and flag the ones that are walking oddly? You really couldn't afford to do that. Now we can. Meaningful productivity impact, meaningful improvement, return on a valuable asset, which is your dairy cows. Being able to do genomic analysis of the milk from various cows, understand the interactions of nutrition, lifestyle, whatever. Meaningful impact at the triangulation points where stuff requires scrupulous attention to insignificant deviations of behavior and minute, exotic subject matter knowledge, okay, we got chips for that now. It's really interesting. Now, people say you're going to take jobs away. Guess what? The farming sector, which went from something like 50% of American employment turn of the century to something like 2% today, is desperately hoping we can build tractors that can see their way around a field because no one wants the job. You've seen the exercises that have been done from time to time where people in the political sphere said, oh, you're worried that undocumented aliens are taking away these jobs from Americans? Hey, we are going to offer 100 watermelon picking jobs to the first comer next week. People don't show up, and the ones that do, they're out of there. They're out of there in less than a day. They can't handle it. They don't want that work. I don't know if you've ever seen a musical called Working, based on Studs Terkel's book of the same name. It is a devastatingly engaging, as in, can't bear to look away from it kind of experience. When people talk about those high-wage manufacturing jobs, that people say, oh my gosh, machines are taking these away. The one that I particularly remember is the woman whose 8-hour shift consists of standing in a pit, doing a below-grade space in a factory floor, working the presses that shape the heavy felt liners of suitcases. And so she's holding the one that just came off the press on her arm while she arranges the material for the next one so she can keep the cycle going. And this is, felt that's just come out of a steamer, so it's, damp and it's heavy, and her shoulder is being destroyed by this. And this is considered a high-wage manufacturing job. This is the thing people are saying, oh my gosh, machines shouldn't take this away. I don't want human beings doing this. I don't. I want a human being supervising 5 robots that do it. And this is what's being done in New England right now, where people who were doing things like pick-and-place work in light manufacturing, they're wearing out. Their bodies are wearing out. You can't hire people who want to do this work anymore, but they are now building relatively low-tech robots. There's a thing called a Baxter that's perfect for this. It's trainable without programming. You literally lead it through the motions, and it learns from repetition what it is you're trying to get it to do. It uses a modicum of machine vision. It's designed to be safe to work around people, so that if it moves and it encounters you, it doesn't just keep on going and break your arm. And one of these folks who's been doing this for years can train and supervise 5 of these robots, which turns out to be a very attractive proposition financially. This was working a second ago. We had this conversation, Zachary, right? Did Rob? Thank you, Adobe, but no, I don't really want to do my flash update right now. This is a good one. You've all seen cat images with various witty captions. They showed them to an AI, and it didn't know what the difference was between the cat and the caption, so it's doing its best. This is an AI's version of a cat. It includes text-like imagery wrapped around what we all recognize as the cat, because, well, there's supposed to be something there, and it looks sort of like this. So that's its approximation of a cat, and it includes that. There's another one of these exercises where a dumbbell in a machine learning system turned out to include a human arm holding it. It did not recognize the distinction between the arm and the dumbbell that had been part of the training data. Oh, you mean carefully curating the training data and keeping track of when the machine is going psycho and steering it back towards sanity is going to require human judgment, experience, insight, and awareness? Yeah, it might. You think that might be a job? You think that might be a much more interesting job, monitoring a herd of AIs and keeping them in line instead of just doing relatively low-value work yourself? Yeah, I think there might be some opportunity there, which is why Gartner says that by 2020, 20% of companies are going to have people whose job is monitoring and supervising AI classification systems and essentially acting as their personal trainer, acting as their coach, acting as their mentor, their guardian against doing stupid stuff. I don't know what career major you pick in school if you plan to be an AI whisperer. I don't think we have a department for that even at MIT quite yet. Normally we're kind of on the leading edge there. So I've got good news. I'm sorry, I left out the good news, bad news joke. You will have a job, but it's going to be harder than the one you have now. If you're still working in 20 years, you're going to be doing stuff that today is considered quite advanced. Unless, of course, you're at the other end of the curve. McAfee and Brynjolfsson and MIT have observed there used to be a fairly linear curve where the more skills you had, the more you got paid. What's happened over the last few decades is that it's become a U-shaped curve. The plumbers are doing fine. The rocket scientists are doing fine. In the middle, that's been kind of the vulnerable area. So if you really like working with your hands, if you want to do artisanal pickles, still going to be a job for that. It's not a huge market. So what are we going to be? We're not going to be database administrators. We're going to be discoverers. We're not going to be handling dense, structured, consistent collections of row and table data and joined relations and such. We're going to be wandering through data, asking it, what do you know? GE Health has done some very interesting work in this regard. They've found some associations that led to research, that led to new understandings of cause and effect mechanisms in a number of very important health areas. Of course, with a rapidly aging population, things that used to be kind of fringe, like various exotic cancers and things like Alzheimer's, suddenly, congratulations, we've looked at infectious disease, you're not dying of heart attacks and respiratory diseases anymore, now you're going to have time to live long enough to get Alzheimer's. And we don't have a cure for that one. So there's a lot of work that's going to be coming, again, out of the dark spaces out there. We're going to be able to look at them long enough to say, oh, wait a minute, there's galaxies worth of opportunity out there. Let's see, data consumption. Someone said, we figured out we've got 800 active users who consume 18,000 reports a day. Maybe there's a possibility that we could present data in more effective ways, so that people don't have to look at 18,000 reports to synthesize some picture of what's going on. There was a very interesting exercise narrated in Technology Review magazine a few years ago, where a company had one of these monthly, multi-inch documents that was circulated to all the senior managers. They replaced it with one page with a grid of little dashboard type charts. This is, of course, before we had dashboards that were on screens. This is back when screens were great big heavy boxes instead of little thin things. But they essentially invented the dashboard order of, 30 years ago. And with some pie charts here and some bar charts there, in every case, the chart would show normal and this month. So at a glance, you could quickly see, no, oh, wait a minute, that's way higher than normal. Okay, I'm going to spend some time on that. And you figured out before your first cup of coffee where your day needed to go, instead of not noticing until tomorrow where yesterday should have gone. Because that's been the problem with drowning people in quantities of data as opposed to well-crafted insights. I mentioned to a number of you my association with the University of Montana, which has been teaching data science now for over 6 years. The first time I went up there to talk with them about creating some data science badges for Trailhead, which oddly enough still doesn't have any really, except those that are kind of tangentially part of Einstein things. The people in the room to meet with me, with no prompting from me whatsoever, were from the schools of business, computer science, mathematics, and visual arts. They got it. They understood. Absent compelling presentation, big data, it's just a bigger pile. And that means we're all now in the communication business. We are all in the cognitive sciences business, whether that was the career path you had in mind or not. We're going to be explainers. Here's a discussion of applications of big data to baseball. Going into a head-first slide, speed decreased by 2.3 miles an hour. He was out by 2/100ths of a second. That takes what could otherwise be a very dry technical statement and turns it into something that even a first base coach can understand. Dude, you sure signaling for the slide was the right thing to do? Really? 2/100ths of a second. You think that might have made a difference? Yeah, that's a lot of time in a game like that. The quantity of data in the baseball field alone, this is beyond hockey stick. The stuff that's coming off of these tools, things like PitchFX, they're insane. But to me, the most interesting aspect of the new data intensity of sport is that they're starting to use it in extraordinarily different ways. Some of you are probably familiar with the new school of basketball metrics, where rather than counting the points or assists that a player scores, They analyze team performance when this player is on the court compared to team performance when not. And even if they can't tell you exactly what that player is contributing, they can still identify value that is not exposed through the traditional activity metric of how many times did you personally put the ball in the basket. But they're starting to look at much more interesting and holistic measures of cooperative work. Tom Malone, MIT Center for Collective Intelligence, I had a number of really great conversations with him about, are we perhaps sabotaging ourselves by starting with meetings, which everyone says don't work, going to other decision-making tools, having email, which many people say, oh, but email, it's so impersonal, blah, 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 and moving more and more toward real-time communication. Congratulations. Now we've reinvented the meeting with all of its defects, with the first person to blurt out anything becomes the anchor around which everybody incrementally makes suggestions. This is usually going to be a male who does this, by the way. And then instead of everybody else really doing what they would have done and making the suggestions they would have made if they were the first to speak, you want everybody kind of instantly gravitating around the first suggestion made that makes any sense at all. And the chance of something genuinely different from the first suggestion coming out of that process has been shown to be pretty bad. Understanding this, building systems that optimize our collective intelligence instead of replacing the dysfunctional in-person meeting with the dysfunctional telepresence meeting, that's going to be something where occasionally you're going to have to raise your hand and say, yeah, we could do that. It does look as if that might be technically better, but here's the reason that you might not want to do that. It might mess up our decision-making process. And people might look at you at that point as if you suddenly sprouted an extra head. What? The Salesforce admin is talking about whether we're optimizing our decision-making process? Don't get over it. Don't get over it. Don't back off just because someone is stupid enough to say, is that really your job? Be prepared to say, I'm sorry, anything that makes us all work better together is all of our jobs here, isn't it? Dare them to disagree with that one. I think we found out last night that sometimes speaking up is a really good idea. Not that I have anything particular in mind. I tell you though, I almost tweeted this when I was walking north on 6th Avenue today. In the space of 30 seconds, I heard two different conversations, one of which said, well, I think this was a real wake-up call for them. And I thought, I'm walking through Manhattan and they're talking about an Alabama senatorial special election. What? Really? That didn't used to happen. And then a little while down the block, someone else said, well, you know, right now, it's not a great time to be a guy. And I thought, yeah. Oh, you're discovering what it's like to live in fear that your words might be misunderstood, or an innocent, gesture or a choice of workplace attire might be misinterpreted. Well, good for you. And again, these are things that we weren't doing a year ago. It's sort of talking about exponential change. But in a connected world, does it make any sense to collect a bunch of data, put it in exactly one place, and then try to wrap protective mechanisms around it in depth, while knowing that not merely well-informed, collaborating armies of private sector attackers are after it, but in some cases national governments are after it? Would you build something that valuable with that big a target painted on it today if you'd realized 30 years ago that the bandwidth to and from the internet today is faster than the bandwidth to and from your CD and your PC used to be? No. You wouldn't build an Equifax and then wait for the inevitable day that someone failed to do a struts update and compromises the whole thing. It was just a matter of time. Someone was going to do something. The bad guys only have to get lucky once. Eventually, they get lucky. No, you would build something like distributed ledgers, which a lot of people call blockchain. Using blockchain as the name for distributed ledger is like using online bookstore as the nickname for Amazon. It's an example, but that's all it is. Blockchain was really developed to do Bitcoin well, and it's the only thing that it arguably does fairly well. But distributed ledgers in general, massively shared truth, cryptographically protected against alteration or inappropriate access by math. Now, it is true that the The Prime Minister of Australia recently said, mathematical laws are all well and good, but in Australia, the laws of Australia are what matter. As I have indicated, the politicians are the last to the party here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, dude. You cannot pass a law that makes strong crypto crackable unless a competent engineer intended for it to be. Blockchain, or distributed ledgers generally, allow us to change the notion of data ownership, the notion of cooperation around shared truth, the notion of immediacy and consistency in transactions. Today, if you sell something out of your brokerage account, it's a 3-day settlement period. In tests done by roughly 4 dozen banks working together, a blockchain, and blockchain's not all that good at this, but a blockchain test reduced that settlement time to something on the order of 30 seconds. This materially alters the behavior of markets that haven't had a meaningful behavior change in 100 years. And the people in this room are definitely in a better position to understand what that can mean than most of the people who are not. Disrupted industries. My colleague Vala Afshar made a list. Yeah, let's see, financial services, talked about that. Healthcare. Doesn't it suck that you have to ask your doctor to send your records to a specialist? Shouldn't you own your records and decide in a very selective way who gets to see what pieces of them? That's obviously where we're going. That's going to happen. Apple's already using very interesting differential privacy technology so that you can do statistical aggregation of medical data with mathematically no chance whatsoever that your individual identity will be compromised in the process. This is extraordinary. This changes the rules, changes things in incredibly important ways. Music, what's music doing here? Intellectual property, baby. Right now it's very difficult to enforce copyrights. And now there's going to be mechanisms by which it's going to be pretty clear, yeah, that is definitely my recording you got out there, I can prove it. I can prove it by a standard that means I can require you to pay me for this. And things like automotive. If you have a shared car, if I'm driving a car, I know how well it's been maintained. When you buy a car, it's not unusual to hope that the driver will hand you the service records. You probably won't flip through them all, but you'll maybe look at the dates and say, yeah, it's been getting regular maintenance. But what if the car owned its own service history? Wouldn't that be an interesting idea? I mean, we've sort of got that now in the form of things like Carfax, but that's an owned monolithic data as asset thing. It's not a shared truth. It's certainly not owned by the car. And that's where we're going to go. And you have to ask these questions about what does the world look like if my medical data is owned by me, if the service for my car is owned by my car. What does that even mean? This is you don't have to wait for the robots to have human rights. This is about whether your car has data rights or whether it can be assumed to have them. So things like who owns the patient medical record? What's going to happen? This is going to change. It's going to be a lot of fun. There are so many ways that this can be screwed up, and most of them will happen by default, if not actively prevented by people who understand this. Just throwing the data into the mill and watching to see what comes out is going to lead to several bad things. Dennis Pumbriak calls it Moneyball failure. Someone reads the book or Heaven Help Us sees the movie, very entertaining story, a lot of grains of truth in it, and comes in saying, we're going to be just like them. No, you're not. In a baseball park, everyone knows how many hits were made and what a hit is, and that hits are important. They might argue about whether that should have been scored as an error, but at the end of the day, everybody knows what the error's number was. In the real world, what to count, how to count it, where to find it, these are much harder work. And so being prepared to say to someone, I'm sorry, you want to treat this like a Moneyball situation where all you have to do is be bold and contrarian and iconoclastic in looking at the numbers that everybody else knows about. Our real breakthroughs are going to come from going and looking at dark spaces on the scoreboard that no one's lit up with numbers yet and saying, here are some numbers that might matter. And that is related to this other one, streetlight effect. You've all heard the story. You're walking down the street at night, someone's searching around with his hands on knees looking for something. You say, hey buddy, what's the problem? Drop my wallet. Let me help you. 5 minutes later, you haven't found the wallet. You say, you sure you dropped it here? Oh no, I dropped it in that dark muddy puddle off the street. Why are we looking here? The light's so much better here. This is also called drunkard's search. There's a Wikipedia page for it. A related idea is what I call over the horizon. It is dangerous to extrapolate because everyone sort of understands standard deviation around a number. There's sort of an equivalent idea around a regression line, only the curves are hyperbolic. They get far apart very, very quickly once you start getting away from places where you've already been. They're reasonably good at saying, yeah, as long as you stay in the familiar neighborhood, things are going to be okay. But people who start making bold forecasts, and if anyone makes a forecast and talks about standard deviation, this is a big, big flag that they know just enough statistics to be dangerous when you put them into a world of data that makes decisions instead of just describing history. And this one, I call this one lost cause. Did you know there's a fascinating correlation between the number of non-commercial space launches and the number of sociology doctorates? Does anyone think there's any predictive power in that historical fact? There's a webpage called Spurious Correlations, and some of them are really entertaining, and some of them are sufficiently politically inappropriate that I do not offer any of them here, but enjoy. But these are 4 things that absolutely will happen in organizations once they begin to drink of the wine of, oh my gosh, look at all this amazing data we can collect. We can collect this data cheaply and precisely and immediately, and yes, congratulations, you can play Moneyball, you can look for the wallet under the streetlight, you can extrapolate out into the zone where your prediction accuracy becomes essentially a wild guess. You can find correlations that have absolutely no predictive power whatsoever, and you can congratulate yourselves on your advanced strategic big data initiative. Well done, everybody. Let's not do that. Let's be guardians of the galaxy here. Someone's got to do it. They seem to be having fun. Data availability only connects with outcomes via policy. When we started measuring hospital readmissions and made hospitals pay big penalties if someone was readmitted to the hospital within 30 days, oh my gosh, look what happened to the number of readmissions. Because now instead of being additional revenue, it was a financial cost to have people come back with a post-operative infection, or failure to take their medication at the prescribed time, or not understanding what this abbreviation of a label meant, so they were taking the pills daily instead of hourly, or whatever. They started setting up little branch clinics. They started, they started having apps. Why? Because you closed a feedback loop. The technology did not wave its hand and say, you need to do this. The technology was an enabler. But thinking about the problem environment and thinking about why it wasn't working and engineering behaviors and institutions, ultimately someone like you probably did that. Someone like you said, we could do that. And no one told you it was your job, probably. But someone said, hey, this is really becoming a problem. What is? Oh, these penalties are paying for the readmits. Have we looked at why we're getting readmits? Yeah, it's the same old stuff. Have we looked at maybe today there are ways to keep that from being like friction or rust, and maybe we can actually do something about those things now? Well, like what? Well, for 25 cents, you can put a chipset in a pill bottle cap that tells you when someone took their pills. And you can figure out pretty darn quickly if they're taking them on schedule or not. Did you know you could do that? You can do that. You'll have conversations like that. You will. This gets us into a subject that, for lack of a better word, is called economics. That sounds like a really weird non sequitur, but Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. Everybody knows that, right? Trick question. No, he didn't. He wrote a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. That's a much more interesting subject. Writing about wealth is boring. Writing about where it comes from and why, ooh. Because now an interesting question arises. Do you think that might change over time? Do you think the sources and mechanisms of producing wealth might be different today than they were when we were making pins in factories with people? Because, in fact, wealth comes from something. And, in Adam Smith's world, he could tell stories about a pin factory. Look at the specialization. Someone cuts the wire, someone straightens the wire, someone grinds the point, someone puts the head on it. And he was all about the idea that industrial power came from doing things at big enough scale that you could afford specialized tools and specialized talent, and you could produce 40, what was that number? Yeah, 10 people could make 48,000 pins in a day. And that was, 1700s, 1800s technology we're talking about. Late 1700s, which is when the book was written. And he thought that this was an unassailable law. This is where wealth comes from. It's from industrial mechanization, putting this stuff all together and being able to build the tools to do this. And this is, of course, the way we did IT for the first 40 or 50 years. It was all about bigger and bigger machines, with skilled people doing very specialized stuff. Well, what do you do? Why do database indexing? Today you'd say, that used to be a job? Who even indexes a database anymore? Scheme of free databases. It's a thing. And then, of course, Karl Marx put a completely different spin on it. He looked, this is the longest single sentence, that is one sentence, by the way. This is the longest single sentence in Karl Marx's Das Kapital, which is not exactly light reading under any circumstances, let alone in the original German. But this is a list of individual crafts, most of them done by people working in their homes, as a watch made its way around the valley in Switzerland, where most of the Swiss watchmaking legendary, craftsmanship and quality come from. And he saw that specialization around a craft not the way Adam Smith did, as impersonal industrialization at scale, but as personal empowerment through artisanal expertise. So it's fascinating to see that two people both looked at this one idea of specialization in almost political, completely opposite ways. It is not that one was right and one was wrong. It was that one culture of production took specialization and brought it all together under one roof and called it a factory and made it a big capitalist thing. Another culture took these crafts of specialization, had people do them in their homes, and gave people much lower barriers to entry and just used the same idea in an absolutely opposite way. And it's so fascinating because people say, oh, technology carries its own imperatives, blah, 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 blah. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. People decide what to do. The tools are not telling us how to use them. They just aren't. And I have no patience with people who say, when you introduce technology, you make things impersonal, you make things this, you make things that. No, you don't. People do that. Organizations do that. There are some interesting experiments that we didn't intend to do over the last few years. We crashed the entire financial system back in 2007. You may recall it made it all the papers. And the side effect was that the interest rate on money went to essentially zero for a while, for about 5 years. Cost of capital was practically nothing. Well, guess what happens when you can borrow money to buy a robot for essentially nothing? Basically pay for the robot over a period of 5 years, and you're not paying anything in terms of rate of return. In every single industry studied, in every single country studied, labor was replaced by technology. The labor share of income went down. And people used to say, oh, in service-intensive industries, a person can only make so many beds and a robot can't make beds, so the hotel industry isn't really going to be affected by this. They're not going to lose room servicing jobs to technology. Yes, they are. Do you know why? Because people were looking at it through much too narrow a view. They were looking at making the bed. They were forgetting that how many rooms a given team can do in a day has a lot to do with whether they have to do them all between noon and 3 o'clock, or that maybe they could spread them out, say, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Have you noticed now that when you make your hotel reservation, they ask you for an estimate of when you'll check in? Have you noticed that if you want to check out late, they're willing to let you do that, but they'll charge you for the privilege? Has it occurred to you that their understanding of the workload leveling curve for their room servicing people is now highly predictable, 24 hours in advance, and they can staff exactly the number of crews they're going to need that day to get all the rooms made up in time for the person who's going to check in, when they're going to check in? Do you think maybe they're getting the same number of rooms serviced with significantly fewer people as a result? Yes, they are. It's a substitution of technology for labor, not by having the technology make the bed, but by having the technology create an environment in which the utilization of labor is dramatically improved. Now, of course, this also means that the crews are probably doing more work. You know, and I'm not saying this is kind. Then again, they're probably getting paid by the hour. They're probably getting paid more. The ones that still have jobs. Lower price of investment goods explained half of the observed decline in the labor share. What was the rest? Well, for example, when you move from making beds to doing financial services, which does take slightly more skill in some cases, there is some shift away from labor-intensive work. But half of the decline in the labor share was replacement of labor with tech, and it worked across all industries in all countries. Here's the other one. What could be more obvious than the idea that someone who's farther away from you is not as big a competitor as someone who lives next door? Right? It costs money to move stuff around, right? Shippers no longer quote prices by the ton mile. They quote them by the ton. Why? That's an actual graph of transport cost per ton versus distance from the maritime freight industry compiled by the UN. For those of you familiar with statistics, on R-squared, or for the rest of you, an R-squared of 0 is a random cloud, and R-squared of 1 is a perfect correlation. The R-squared is 0.02. Distance, 98% doesn't matter anymore. The last time my wife wanted her favorite sugar-free mints and couldn't find them locally, she ordered them on Amazon. They came to us from Hong Kong at a price that was cheaper than we would have paid at the Walgreens down the street. Once you discover the power of the dark side as an Amazon Prime customer, it really does change your behavior. It does. I try to patronize small businesses, but once my wife wanted her favorite brand of dental floss, I went to 6 drugstores over a period of 2 hours, couldn't find it, ordered it on Amazon, got her a 2-year supply for a third of the price of one package, and it was there free the next day. Oh, please. I want to be a good person, but it's getting hard. We've talked about the U-shaped wage curves, but I will just mention one thing, which is that when Andy and Eric took their first ride in a Google car, they said after the first 10 minutes, you stopped thinking about the fact that a robot was driving. Why? Because it's a better driver than most people. Fewer panic stops, fewer sudden changes of direction, fewer horns being honked at you for doing something unpredictable. True story, the only incidents today where an autonomous vehicle has been involved in a 2-car collision have occurred when the autonomously driven vehicle drove more courteously than the human driver behind it expected. Stopped at the yellow light instead of accelerating to go through, things like that. In other words, once the robots are all driving the way we were told in driver's ed we were supposed to drive, driving is going to be a lot less exciting than it is today. Now, specialization. Robert Heinlein, science fiction author, was not a fan of specialization for whatever political purpose. Some of you may be familiar with this rather long sentence from one of his books, which I've broken out into a 2-column list of the things that human beings should be able to do, including change a diaper, plan an invasion, program a computer, and cook a decent meal. With the tagline, which many of us use as shorthand for the entire thought, is specialization is for insects. Insects are a useful illustration of the distinction between intelligence and complexity of behavior. Many people are impressed by complexity and confuse it for intelligence. There are termites in the southwest US that chew up organic material and spit it out in the form of a mud that they then fabricate into towers in which they live. And the internal structure of these towers is not trivial. They demonstrate, in fact, crude principles of air conditioning. And people said, wow, who knew termites were that smart? To which their reply is, if you put them in Antarctica, they will also build air-conditioned towers there too. Their behavior is not intelligent. Their behavior is complex, highly specialized, and not adaptive. They do not respond to new situations with experimentation or learning or imaginative breakout trials of weird pilot projects. They don't do that. That takes actual intelligence. A lot of what people call machine intelligence, machine learning, it's really narrowly focused specialization around a particular kind of complex function that people don't do consistently well, and that machines can now do without a person having to understand them well enough to program. It's really what it comes down to. Boy, it's hard to get a person who can program that. Don't bother. Plug in the learning algorithm, and in 3 hours it's doing it better than the software we used to write for it. AI, I'm not prepared to call that intelligence. It's useful, but it's not intelligent. And tomorrow's teams are going to be defined by not specializing, by refusing to be narrowly cast as a specialist. I interview high school seniors for MIT every year. They're startled to find out we're just as interested in their sports and their music and their performing arts stuff as we are in their academics. Why? Because people who've done that kind of thing have built some chops in collaboration, creativity, and discipline that are at least as important as whether you can sit for an hour filling in bubbles on a score sheet. At least as important. And so there are people in our industry who say, I don't look to existing disciplines for new ideas. I want people who represent wildly different things sitting around the table, and maybe one of them says something that sparks a metaphor from another. This is where we're going. You change the game when you bring people together with different fields. And if you can be someone who attracts diverse people, understands where they're coming from, sees interesting ways of triangulating the way you think with what you know how to do, you become like that basketball player on the court who makes the whole team score better, even though you're not the one who's shooting the ball. We've been waiting all night for this. This is the future of work. Anyone see the movie Elysium? Not a particularly wonderful movie, but the first half hour is the most brilliantly, frighteningly realized vision of the world that many people fear we are building for them to inhabit. They actually filmed it on location in an enormous garbage dump in Mexico, which they then populated with some shanties and some poorly clad, not very clean people, of whom the most successful had jobs at the robot factory, painting the robots. And anyone who had any actual money or symbol manipulating skills lived on a space station called Elysium, hence the movie. The movie would have done well to be a 6-part miniseries because the last 15 minutes of the movie really should have been another several hours. Because once you've broken the back of the resolute polarization of that economy, I'm sorry, everybody doesn't have free medical care the next day. Doesn't happen quite that smoothly. I really wish that they made a 2-part movie about Elysium in the next 5 years. But the beginning probably should be required viewing for people who do what we do. If you want to get inside the head of the people who wonder if that's what you're setting them up to have, really understanding how it feels to be someone 40 to 55 years old, moderate skills, maybe has a shop, you got a union card, and you're thinking, what the heck? What am I going to do? What are my kids going to do? Arguably, the last presidential election, more than anything else, pivoted around people who were certain that neither of the established parties had an answer to the question, what work is there going to be for my kids so they can have a middle-class existence even as good as what I've got, and the certainty that whatever the unknown was going to do, it couldn't be worse. A lot of analysis suggests that that's really what it was about. And we need to be part of that conversation. We're not going to get there with traditional education. Unless you believe in reincarnation, we can all pretty much agree. We all started out as pretty much an empty circle, didn't know a whole lot. Toilet training and learning to take naps later, the circle is starting to get filled in. First grade, you can sharpen a pencil. It's an interesting skill. Teaching a robot to sharpen pencils well might be an interesting exercise, but it's not exactly a career path. Second grade, JavaScript, same. Maybe a bump begins to emerge at this point where you start to be an artsy type compared to a math and sciencey type, maybe. And maybe that bump is exaggerated, and by the time you get to high school, you're clearly in one camp or the other, which is a bad idea already, that you've been typecast as an arts type or a science type or a jock or whatever. That's not a good thing. Then you get your undergraduate degree, and when your bump hits the edge of what's in books, they give you a bachelor's degree and pat you on the head and send you off into the workspace. Unless, of course, you decide to hang around pushing the boundaries of that envelope. At which point you work for several years and then BAM! You broke through the edge, and I have been to both my sons and my daughter-in-law's hooding ceremonies, and they congratulate you on now you are a member of the academy. This is the language they use. You're one of the people who creates new knowledge instead of merely absorbing and applying that which the academy has created for you. There's your PhD. And your world is made up of people who are like you and people who are trying to become like you. But to the rest of the world, you look like that. And that's not a full circle. That's one pixel on the rim of a multi-million pixel circle. And I need the circle. I don't want to make that bump 20 times bigger. Microsoft is very proud of the 5,000 data scientists they've hired. Well, congratulations. They can go ahead and build an idiot savant that knows absolutely nothing about sales, service, or marketing, but boy is it clever about what it doesn't know. That's why Einstein is different. It's better AI than they've got, and it lives in an environment where the world's best selling, servicing, and marketing are already happening, and that's why it's relevant. And the rest of the stuff is a work on a circle. It's important, and you need to be able to advance the idea that it's not that it's AI that matters. It's that you're there for the first time to help people put AI into a place where there's stuff it can learn instead of having to hire and train very expensive people to teach the idiot. Now you can plug it in and expect it to learn useful stuff. And this is a crucial distinction. It's also part of how you interact with the world. If that's your Twitter network, good. Notice that most of the people this person interacts with do not interact with each other, as opposed to a network like that, which largely consists of people reinforcing each other's beliefs and superstitions. So the number of followers you've got, not nearly as important as the secondary interconnection among them. If all your followers know each other, that's not a good thing. You personally are in a position to start drawing pictures of, am I really plugged into a world that's going to give me multiple perspectives, which I'm going to be forced to acquire. Triangulations, and not just reinforcements of what I believe to be true. Transdisciplinarity doesn't like this, look like this, and sure doesn't look like that. And that's a serious issue. And it's being addressed by great Salesforce customers like the Girl Scouts, who've rolled out more STEM-oriented badges in the last 2 years than they had in their prior entire history. They're a fabulous, fabulous resource that most of industry does not appreciate in terms of its ability to produce the kind of young women that they want to be able to hire, that they claim today they can't hire, and that Wall Street thinks can't start companies. But guess what? If you look at the startup population, most of which is founded by men, on average, you do about as well as if you bought an index fund, on average. Spectacular successes, hugely overwhelmed by failures. But if you confine yourself only to investing in companies with female founders or co-founders, you do 63% better returns than the vast majority of the firms that are founded by men only. Gee, the things that data can teach you, if you ask it the right questions. And finally, strategies. We all need to have a strategy. And most strategies aren't. They're plans. But I'm working with an organization, Philadelphia Alliance for Capital and Technology, about this year's forum conference. PH already went. I wrote most of their marketing stuff last year, so they asked me to do it again. And I said, okay, this year, I think the sentence needs to be, most things that people call strategies are plans to solve yesterday's problems with tomorrow's versions of today's technology. Because if you think about it, that's most of what gets passed around. It's most of what gets done. Oh, this is the problem we've been having. Here's this cool new thing. That's going to get better by this much in the next 10 years, so that's the strategy. No, I'm sorry, it's not. Take as an example, Uber. Did they develop faster cars? Did they train better drivers? Did they use Internet of Things to make the cars talk to each other so they could optimize their routes across the crowded city? They didn't do any of that. They widened their view and said the problem that needs to be solved is that getting from the 5th floor of building X to the 7th floor of building Y sucks. It's now when you're on the 5th floor of building X, you can already be calling your car. And when you get to the curb and you're already late for your meeting on the 7th floor of building 7, you don't have to waste any time fishing for your wallet and being told that that credit card is not accepted. You thank the driver, get out of the car, and get on with your day. That's what Uber is. They didn't improve the performance of the prior activity with the new technology and call that a strategy. They didn't. They took a big view of what the problem was that wasn't getting solved well, and then went looking for technology that said, oh, wait a minute, we could do that with an app. They didn't begin with an app. There are taxi companies now that have apps. And they're adapting as well as they can. But that's what Uber did right. They didn't take the existing activities, lubricate them with new tech, and call that their strategy for disruption. They looked at the experience. And the very, very last thing, I just ran across this in the last week or two. Those of you who follow me on Twitter will realize at least half the slides up here came from things I've tweeted in the last 2 weeks. That's the only way I can ever be sure of giving you guys new stuff that you haven't seen before. Someone said something that I thought was really interesting. How you do anything is how you do everything. If you're allowing your time to be occupied with stuff that you know in your gut does not have real value, well, don't wait for someone else to notice that. Raise your hand and say, why are we doing this way? You might discover, for example, as once happened at Motorola, that a 20-step process, at least 10 of those steps only existed because 2 activities used to be done in separate buildings at a time when producing a paper document and getting it to the other building was the only way to make the next step happen. And yet they had faithfully re-implemented those steps in new technology all the way along and never really gone back to the fundamental purpose of the process and re-engineered it to use the new stuff. Sometimes you just have to raise your hand. Robert Townsend was talking to the people at Texas Instruments once, and he didn't just talk to the senior execs. Robert was running Avis at the time. He went out and talked to engineers. Radical idea. And one said, oh man, we could get so much stuff done if we didn't spend so much time on paperwork. We're just getting a new oscilloscope here takes 2 months. Charlie, you and I both know what it's like when the procedures get in the way of you doing what you know you ought to be doing, right? Oh, the expense reporting alone, really. The upshot of this is that Robert had a conversation with the CEO. He said, one of your engineers mentioned it takes 2 months to get a piece of test equipment. The CEO looked, thought, and literally put his head in his hands and said, oh my God. We put in those controls 2 years ago when we were having a temporary cash flow problem. We never took them away. And they've just been the way stuff got done for 2 years. So for heaven's sake, once in a while, ask the question. What's the assumption behind this? Maybe some of you saw the tweet I did a while ago off of a Dilbert, and I said it's pointless to claim that you're data-driven if assumptions are holding the steering wheel and unstated beliefs are drawing the map. And being prepared to walk around the company saying, what's the belief that led to this? What's the assumption that's in control of this? Is that assumption in a spreadsheet somewhere? Can we change that number and see what happens? Have we ever looked at what the actual uncertainty is on that? Okay, fine, you're doing something with an expected value of 1. Have you realized yet that the standard deviation is plus or minus 3? So there's actually a almost 50% chance it's going to come in negative? Do you realize that? The data will not command you to notice this. And a bigger pile of data will not tell you more loudly to notice this. And the future of work is saying, I got a machine for that now. I got an algorithm for that now. I got a chip for that now. It doesn't take my job away. It lets me start doing my job. And lets me start living my life. And lets me start, caring about the people I work with more than I care about the forms that they fill out. And I hope you all go out and kick ass. Thank you very much.
Boy, have I kept you living.
It was worth it, Peter.
Thank you so much.